Welcome everyone to the final round of EIF's third winter championship. We've got some awesome conflict-themed hypos, and our first speaker, Tai Tan, is ready to go. He's going to be speaking on the hypothetical. After an intense rush of FOMO, South Korea decides to join the Russo-Ukrainian war on the side of Ukraine. How does South Korea's entry into the war affect its outcome?
Also, is it okay if I
And
time myself on my phone?
yeah, of course, you don't want any time signals?
I can do time signals as well.
Okay, cool. I can do a 5 down, C at 30, fist at grace.
Okay, sounds good.
Awesome. I'm ready when you are.
Okay. After all the crazy political events of 2024, South Korea felt a little bit left out. So, in order to cure his FOMO about missing out on international politics, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol decided to declare martial law and militarily take over South Korea's capital, only now to have impeachment on the horizon. Yet South Korea only doesn't have FOMO for international politics. They also have FOMO for missing out on international wars. As the Simpson Center articulates on August 19th of 2024, South Korea, through military policies enacted by Yoon Suk-yeol, has been building up their military capabilities with tanks, aircraft, and manpower to now become possibly the fourth largest defense exporter by 2027. Yet, by building up their military capabilities, Yoon Suk-yeol, and trying not to be missing out on international war, probably wants to test his own military capabilities. So, with Tabram explaining just 30 minutes ago that South Korea has finally decided to join the war in Ukraine, North Korea's presence in the region finally gives South Korea the chance to test out their military capabilities in the defense of Ukraine itself. Yet, considering that the real world implications of a country joining in for new support in Ukraine could change the tide of the war entirely, the real world implications of this question make it imperative we ask today's question. After an intense Russia FOMO, South Korea decides to join the war in Ukraine on the side of Ukraine. How does South Korea's entry into the war affect the war's outcome? The answer is by reinforcing Ukrainian capabilities. This can be seen by first, increasing manpower, second, by boosting their military capabilities, and finally, by rallying the international community back in support of Ukraine. Now, first, the single biggest issue for Ukraine right now in their war against Russia has to be their lack of manpower. Yet South Korea can solve this. The first reason as to why South Korea's entry into the war changes the outcome is by boosting the manpower of Ukrainian support. As the Deccan Herald newspaper explains, just yesterday, Ukraine is facing a major manpower shortage in which they're outnumbered by Russian troops nearly 10 to 1. This is because Volodymyr Zelensky, fearing political chaos, doesn't want to send the remaining 18 to 25-year-olds who are left in Ukraine's major cities onto the front lines, as there simply aren't enough to maintain economic support for Ukraine if they're taken out entirely. As a result, South Korea's entry into the war changes their manpower situation. As further explained by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, on March 22nd of 2024, South Korea's military capabilities are huge because of the size of their manpower, having nearly 500,000 active military and getting nearly 200,000 more to join every single year. Their entry into Ukrainians' war could see hundreds of thousands of South Korean troops joining in support of Ukraine. Seeing this rush of support through new troops from South Korea, Ukraine could finally see the tide of war change against Russia, because they'll no longer be lagging down in the ditches, trying to get more troops to keep fighting in the war. Yet, second, Ukrainians are literally in the ditches because they don't have enough guns to keep fighting and keeping Russia away. Yet, the second way in which South Korea joining the war changes the war's outcome is by boosting Ukraine's military capabilities, specifically through weaponry. As first explained by the Foreign Policy magazine on April 22nd of 2024, Ukraine has a major artillery shortage and other weaponry, in which they lack or are only able to shoot upwards of 2,000 artillery shells every single day, an amount that can barely keep Russia at bay. This is because support from the West, and specifically the US, have failed to get enough artillery shells to Ukraine at a time when they desperately need it, meaning they're on the back foot as they keep Russia at bay. As a result, however, South Korea's major military advancements may finally be able to help. As further explained by the Stratfor Corporation on November 27th of 2024, South Korea has the artillery capabilities to support Ukraine in their efforts to keep Russia away. More specifically, they have upwards of 3 million artillery shells in reserves that they aren't using at all. These 3 million reserves could be brought to finally allow Ukraine to shoot more artillery back against Russia and ensure that their pushes in both Kursk and keeping the Donbass safe will finally be secured because they're no longer running out of artillery to keep shooting them. Additionally, South Korea has the tanks as well as aircraft to support Ukraine even further. Advancing these military capabilities will ensure that Ukraine has the support and military support it's from South Korea to keep building up their military itself. Yet, finally, Zelensky's career past as a comedian may be coming back to bite him because when asking for pleas of support for Ukraine, many in the international community are taking his pleas as jokes. The final reason as to why South Korea joining the war in Ukraine changes the war's outcome by rallying the international community. As first explained by the BBC on April 24th of 2024, Zelensky has been traveling around the globe and is advocating for his victory plan and asking for European as well as the United States to join in support of Ukraine. Yet, changing politics within many European countries and the United States changed the political will to continue to support Ukraine. Thus, many of these European nations have pulled away from supporting Ukraine as anti-Ukrainian sentiment continues to rise. Yet South Korea may be able to change its growing anti-Ukrainian sentiment and rally support for Ukraine once again. As the Associated Press details on November 27th of 2024, as soon as South Korea saw North Korea join the war in Ukraine, they met with Ukrainian officials to discuss strategic alliances against North Korea. Now joining the war, South Korea has the capability to rally the international community in Ukraine's support by requiring them or using their military alliances to possibly get other nations like the United States to join in on supporting Ukraine furthermore. This can be done by possibly forcing the US to continue to support Ukraine, and if not, the South Korea would draw away from supporting the US's alliances in the Indo-Pacific. Either way, South Korea has the political will and support to change how countries support Ukraine, so they can rally the international community in Ukraine's support itself. So, considering the real-world implications of today's question in getting Ukraine to win the war in Russia, it becomes imperative that when we return to today's question, how does South Korea entry into the war affect the war's outcome? The answer is that it reinforces Ukraine's capabilities by, first, increasing manpower, second, boosting military capabilities, and finally, by rallying the international community. And so, while Ukraine, or rather South Korea, wanted to pull a political stunt to finally get careful or be cared for on the international stage, they don't only care about international politics, but they now are also caring about international war in getting Ukraine to finally win.
Congratulations, and thank you so much. That speech was 7 minutes and 16 seconds just for my other judges. I believe you're going to be cross-examined by our sixth speaker, Boyana. Just for reference, I'm going to have a 3-minute cross-examination period. I'm going to put up a 2 at 2 minutes, 1 at 1 minute, C at 30 seconds, and then a fist when there's 0. So, Boyana, are you ready to go?
Yep. I'm all good if
Cool.
everyone else is.
Yep.
All right. Then I'll start my timer now. First off, congrats on an amazing speech. And I just have a few questions. But first, let's begin with the thesis of your entire speech, which essentially says that with South Korea joining the war, it's going to reinforce Ukraine and therefore bring them closer to an outcome where they win. I want to ask, despite Western aid being brought in since the very beginning, why does the outcome still remain skewed in Russia's favor?
I think the biggest issue when it comes to Western aid is that they haven't been consistent enough in supporting Ukraine. We've seen, like, for example, the US $60 billion aid package has been stalled in Congress, failing to get enough artillery to Ukraine right now. So while there is Western aid, it simply isn't consistent enough.
Thank you. And let's move on to your first point, where you talk about more support coming in the form of manpower. I want to ask, despite South Korea adding troops to the war, what's preventing Russia and its own allies from offsetting this, such as how North Korea recently got integrated to the conflict as well?
I think the biggest issue when it comes to Russia being able to offset it is simply while Russia has the troops and they are putting troops into the war right now, they're losing a lot of troops just because they keep running their troops straight into the fight and not really paying attention whether or not they die or not. So Russia having a lot of troops only keeps Ukraine at a fault right now because Ukraine doesn't have enough troops to match it at all. If Russia was to raise their troop count, it wouldn't matter because the South Korean troops would be able to match that number.
Understood. Then let's go on to your second point about artillery. You talk about South Korea having an upwards of 3 million artillery shells in reserves. And yet, as we both likely know, they also face the threat of their northern neighbor. What's preventing them from saving those reserves for a more pertinent conflict to them, such as if North Korea were to provoke them?
Well, I think right now North Korea's involvement in the Russian-Ukrainian war does pose a threat to South Korea itself. So by taking the artillery, when they have 3 million reserves, to the Russian-Ukrainian front lines, they're not only engaging in the war, but also engaging in fighting their most important enemy, North Korea.
Mm-hmm. Understood. Then finally, let's move on to your third point about Ukraine being able to garner support from other countries that until now may have been hesitant. As we both know, until now, many countries have gone the extra mile while others haven't. And this is also true in the case of Russia, with North Korea providing troops while others have hesitated. What about South Korea will make it an exception to this rule until now?
I think South Korea has the capabilities to specifically get other nations to join in rallying support for Ukraine. More specifically, South Korea's military, rather political situation, or rather positioning within the globe, lets them specifically work with the United States to push them to join more in support for Ukraine, specifically through their positioning in the Indo-Pacific, where they could use that positioning to get the US and influence them to support Ukraine even more. While South Korea, because of their geopolitical position, makes them uniquely positioned to change how countries view Ukraine and support them in the future.
Perfect. That's 3 minutes. And thanks once again.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all so much. All right. Our next speaker is Sash Sivaraman, and he's going to be speaking on question 9, which is Xi Jinping launches a Pearl Harbor style attack on Okinawa base alongside an invasion of Taiwan. How should the United States respond? And could you let us know if and how you would like time signals?
I can just time myself if that's all right.
That's all good with me.
All right, perfect. Are all my judges ready? All right, great. Imagine if I took a rubber band about this big and then stretched it this wide until it was about to explode. You would think to yourself, that's a lot of tension. And I would respond by saying, if you think that's a lot, you haven't seen the current situation between China and Taiwan. The United States Institute of Peace explains on October 7th of this year how China, who has historically wanted to invade Taiwan for the better part of a century, has been significantly increasing their arms and aggression against a small island that the United States is in stark support of. And when considering this, it becomes pretty clear that tensions at any point could explode, and would evidently be a lot more deadly than a rubber band. Considering that approximately several million would die in the case of a prolonged war between the two countries, it becomes imperative to answer the following hypothetical. Xi Jinping launches a Pearl Harbor-style attack on the Okinawa base in Japan, and alongside this, an invasion of Taiwan. How should the United States respond? The answer is by considering all scales of time, the short-term, medium-term, and long-term, by doing the following. First, providing immediate humanitarian support. Next, by reinforcing the Indo-Pacific's military. Before finally looking towards how exactly we can win a battle of attrition. In this scenario, immediately China is going to strike Taiwan, and it's up to the United States to ensure that in this initial invasion, it's not a complete wipeout. The first way that the United States to respond in this scenario is by providing immediate economic and humanitarian, specifically, aid. NPR explains on October of this year how an amphibious invasion of Taiwan would ultimately cost several thousand lives on the Taiwanese front, and when put in the context of an Okinawa attack too, That's several hundred deaths as well that the United States ultimately has to deal with. Additionally, there's going to be at least tens of thousands of casualties as well. This is terrible for Taiwan because if China takes this momentum they have with this invasion, then they could wipe out the entire island in a matter of days. This is why the United States needs to provide immediate humanitarian support in order to help Taiwan and Japan in the short term. This is something completely within the United States' reach, too. In fact, the United States Agency for International Development in February of 2016 explains how when an earthquake struck Taiwan and Japan at this time, the United States was able to immediately provide both locations with immediate access to emergency devices as well as shelter. And so, if the United States uses its forward deployed resources within the Indo-Pacific to immediately provide aid to all of those harmed, then ultimately they can help build Taiwanese resilience, which is incredibly critical to ensure that China won't completely invade Taiwan upon the initial invasion. Once China has struck once, the United States needs to make sure that China can never strike as hard again. The next way the United States should respond in this scenario when considering an invasion of China on Taiwan is by continually reinforcing the Indo-Pacific. The Atlantic Council explains on October 17th how the Indo-Pacific, which the United States has a significant military presence in, will be quickly drained of all of their weapons just several months into a long-term conflict with China. And so, this would give China more and more momentum, because they aren't being deterred from launching a full-scale invasion and continually attacking Taiwan at all. In fact, this goes against the United States' current strategy of strategic ambiguity, whereby giving Taiwan and the rest of the Indo-Pacific more and more weapons, they are deterring China from attacking. It's this very same strategy that the United States needs to employ during wartime, where, by continually stocking the Indo-Pacific and even Taiwan with weapons, they can prevent China from attacking over and over again. They'll see that this is turning into a battle of attrition. And, as the Global Taiwan Institute explains in April of last year, a battle of attrition is the last thing that China wants. Right now, they're looking for peaceful reunification. If that's not going to happen, then they'll want Taiwan as quickly and effectively as possible. And in a drawn-out war, it's a fact that China simply doesn't want it and won't be as committed. If we continually stock the Indo-Pacific with weapons that will deter further Chinese attacks, then ultimately the United States will help Taiwan and Japan in this case. But finally, if China were to seriously draw out this war, then ultimately it'd be a battle of attrition that, if the United States employs this next strategy, Taiwan could ultimately win. The last way that the United States would respond in the case of a Pearl Harbor-style attack on Japan and an invasion of Taiwan is by considering the long term and placing economic sanctions on China and coordinating it with the rest of the world. Right now, approximately 20% of China's GDP, according to a most recent CFR report, comes from their exports. China is an export giant, and they're reliant on it for its entire GDP right now. And if the United States were to coordinate sanctions against this country for invading Taiwan, which is very plausible considering existing sanctions that the United States and much of Europe already have, then we can slash this 20% down to a 10%. This would help collapse China's economy in a time where they're still struggling from zero COVID. And ultimately, this would help China lose a battle of attrition and give the United States an advantage. With economic sanctions such as this, China is losing the very core of what they rely on for their GDP. In a time where they're already struggling, this strike will ensure that they cannot continually fuel a war that they'll ultimately lose in this battle of attrition. By employing this strategy, the United States can ultimately help Taiwan and Japan. And so today, we looked at the question, Xi Jinping launches a Pearl Harbor-style attack on Okinawa base and additionally invades Taiwan. How should the United States respond? The answer came by considering the short term, the medium term, and the long term. By first, looking towards how to provide immediate humanitarian aid to the region. Next, by militarily reinforcing the Indo-Pacific, before finally giving long-term support in the form of economic sanctions on China. If the United States is able to employ all of these strategies in this hypothetical scenario, then hopefully When the rubber band finally explodes, the United States could at least contain the metaphorical explosion.
Congratulations. Just for my judges, that was 713. And your cross examiner is going to be Ty. Just for everyone, I'm going to do time signals because this is a 3-minute cross examination. Two at 2 minutes, one at 1 minute, C at 30 seconds, fist when you have nothing left. And Ty, once you ask your first word, I'll start the timer.
Congratulations on a great speech. I just have a few questions. So, overall, on your thesis was that the US should first, or rather, we start first by providing humanitarian aid to Taiwan. On that first point, shouldn't I just like my personal thought, or like just in terms of things, wouldn't providing aid first not really work if China is invading Taiwan?
Well, the fact of the matter is that not all of the people who are going to be involved in the invasion on the Taiwanese front are going to die immediately. In fact, helping with casualties is something the United States has time and time again done, including in the earthquake scenario. Even while aftershocks of the earthquake continued happening, the United States was able to continually provide aid. And so, in the case of a Chinese invasion, it would be quite deadly, but ultimately, it's something that's not outside of the United States' reach.
Okay, now second, does in your hypothetical scenario, does the US ever militarily intervene in like the defense of Taiwan specifically by fighting against China?
Well, in this scenario, I'm posing that the United States isn't doing this in order to ensure the best possible outcome for Taiwan in this scenario, in order to help ensure that nuclear conflict isn't ultimately created.
Okay, sure. Now just moving on to like your third point. One of your things you claim is that the US should, with other European nations, put sanctions across China and like try to cut off basically exports. Isn't the US reliant on Chinese exports?
Well, the fact of the matter is that the United States has been cutting off China for a long time now. After the trade war we had with China, and next year, when Donald Trump places significant tariffs on them yet again, we will be decreasing our reliance on them more and more, and continue building a reliance on the countries that we already are building reliances with, such as Mexico and Southeast Asia.
Okay, sure. Continuing on the third point, considering that China's a major player in the global economy, wouldn't trying to cut out China entirely have major global implications on like economics throughout the entire globe?
Sure, and admittedly, in my point, I did make sure to mention that not all of their GDP that comes from exports would be cut out. For example, Africa would start probably still rely on China. That being said, major countries, especially those in Europe and those in North America that have already been taking part in sanctions on China or increased tariffs on them, will probably be able to lean more into these very same tariffs or sanctions in order to stimulate their own domestic growth or even look towards other options.
Okay, sure. And I'll just have one more question. So, on your overall thesis, you try to say that the US doesn't really, or they should enforce, or I'll go to your second point actually. The US should enforce the Indo-Pacific. But shouldn't the US presence be focused on actually stopping China's invasion, not just reinforcing what they already have?
Well, sure, but the forward deployed resources the United States currently has are all across the Indo-Pacific. In fact, they have no troops currently in Taiwan, so it's not really sustainable to go ahead and do that. The only way they can do what you are describing is by continually reinforcing the Indo-Pacific.
Okay, and thank you. That's time.
All right. Thank you both so much. I'd just like to check if our next speaker is here yet.
Hi, I'm here.
Awesome. Awesome. Our next speaker, Daniela, is going to be speaking on hypothetical number 8. In a midnight coup, George Friedrich deposes Olaf Scholz and declares himself Kaiser of the new German Empire. What steps should you, as Kaiser Friedrich, take to restore Germany's former glory? And how would you like time signals, if at all?
Sure, can I just have five down? So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. C at 6:30 and a fist at 7. And if I get to 7:20, just like frantically wave. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. Okay, you can just start my time on my first word. In The Princess Diaries, ordinary girl next door, Mia finds out that she is secretly the princess of a tiny European nation. When I was growing up, I wanted to be just like her. Wake up one day and discovered that I was a princess. So, when I chose today's prompt and realized I would be taking the role of Kaiser Frederick, Prince of Prussia, I was thrilled. Until I looked into Germany's economic situation. Now I'm a little less thrilled. But considering that the economic crisis within Germany is already impacting the millions of people within the country and Europe at large, we have to consider today's hypothetical scenario. In a midnight coup, George Frederick deposes Olaf Scholz and declares himself Kaiser. What steps should you, as Kaiser Frederick, take to restore Germany's former glory? And the answer is that I would relax the debt brake. First, let's look at what the debt brake is and why it's in place in the first place, before, secondly, looking at why relaxing it is good for the economy, and finally, looking at why relaxing it is good for the government. But first, let's talk about what the debt brake is in the first place. CNBC discusses in November of 2024 that the debt brake is a unique fiscal measure that Germany took after the 2008 recession. Because of the recession, many banks within Germany went under. So Germany decided to tighten their banking regulations, and they created the debt brake, which is essentially a cap on how much debt the German government is allowed to take out as a percentage of their GDP. And this measure was agreed upon in 2009 and has remained relatively static since then, with one exception. Reuters discusses in November of 2024 that during the COVID-19 pandemic, in an emergency measure, the debt brake was relaxed so that Germany would have more money to give its citizens during this time of economic hardship. And although this measure is in place to allow for the debt brake to be relaxed during times of national emergency, at the end of the day, we should just get rid of it altogether because it's not helping Germany at all. In fact, it is stifling their economic growth. And we saw this especially in the post-COVID era, when Germany decided to bring the debt brake back. So, the best way to restore the former glory to Germany is to focus on relaxing the debt brake, because it's preventing economic growth. But now that we know what the debt brake is, let's look at specifically why it's been so bad for the German economy and why it would be a good idea for me, as Kaiser Frederick, to relax it. Now, Trading Economics discusses in their report from November of 2024 that German unemployment spiked at 6.1%, and this large amount of unemployment was likely caused by the debt brake. Because of the debt brake, Germany can't afford to invest in key corporations and small startups, and this makes business that much harder to accomplish within Germany. And no business means no jobs for the German public. The Indiana University discusses in March of 2021 that in particular, government investment is key to revitalizing small businesses because it creates a better business model and therefore a better job market. Because of the debt brake, Germany doesn't have sufficient funds to invest in small businesses. So, to revitalize its economy, relaxing the debt brake is critical. Fixing Germany's economic system is the best way to return it to its former glory, and the only way Germany can do that is by relaxing the debt brake. The debt brake didn't just affect Germany's economy, though. It also affected its entire system of parliamentary government, which is the third reason relaxing the debt brake is so key for me as Kaiser Frederick, because it caused problems in Germany's government. The New York Times discusses, this time in an article from December of 2024, published just a few days ago, that the whole reason the debt brake triggered a government collapse was because of disagreements within Germany's parliamentary government. One party was in favor of the debt brake and one was opposed. So Olaf Scholz held a confidence vote, which he ended up losing. So, DW discusses in November of 2024, though, that Olaf Scholz's role isn't the only one that is vacant within the German government. So even if Kaiser Frederick takes on this role, the finance ministry office would still remain vacant, because Olaf Scholz fired him. But relaxing the debt brake is going to stop all of the infighting within the German government and ensure that things can actually be accomplished within the parliament. At the end of the day, the political system within Germany is beyond repair because of this debt brake. So, to prevent this collapse and make the German government and parliament much more efficient, we need to relax the debt brake so that the Office of Finance Ministry can be taken over effectively. Reuters discusses the necessity of this in a different article from December of 2024, discussing that every day the German government is collapsed, they are losing thousands of dollars because of inefficiencies, and that they need a finance minister who is going to act efficiently. Currently, a vote is scheduled for March, but if the German government could actually get things together, they could make this vote earlier and fill this key position, therefore ending the government collapse by ending the debt brake much, much sooner. At the end of the day, though, being Prince of Prussia doesn't seem like it would be all fun and games, especially in the hypothetical situation where Kaiser Frederick declares himself head of Germany. So when we consider today's scenario, in a midnight coup, George Frederick deposes Olaf Scholz and declares himself Kaiser of the new German Empire. What steps should you, as Kaiser Frederick, take to restore Germany's former glory? The answer is that I have to relax the debt brake. First, we looked at what the debt brake is and why it's in place, before, second, looking at why relaxing it is good for the economy, and finally, looking at why relaxing it will make the government that much more efficient. Thank you. And can I
All
just
right.
ask for time on that?
Yeah, of course. For Daniela and all the judges, that was 6 minutes and 52 seconds.
Okay,
Now
thank
we're going to move to 3 minutes of cross-examination. So I believe that's going to be Sash. Again, the time signals are going to be 2 minutes left, 1 minute left, 30 seconds left, and no time left.
Got it. Thank you.
Mhm.
Hi, and congratulations on making it to finals and having an excellent speech. I just have a few questions.
Of
So,
course.
regarding your first point, wouldn't getting rid of the debt brake increase the interest rates within the country, as that's why the debt brake is in place to keep the interest rate low?
Sure. Well, I can tell you that although this measure worked in the first place and that it was successful previously in Germany, keeping these interest rates using the debt brake is no longer serving them. And we saw this in a multitude of ways, but mainly because of the large amounts of inflation in Germany, but also because of the high levels of unemployment that I mentioned in my second point.
Okay, so do you agree that by getting rid of the debt brake, ultimately interest rates would increase?
Yes, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that small increases in interest rates could actually help Germany overall. And then at the end of the day, once things have kind of cooled down within Germany, they can get those interest rates back to where they were previously.
Great, that moves me on to my next question regarding your second point. So, if interest rates are higher, that naturally for people borrowing money makes it more difficult to get the loans that they need. Won't this make it more difficult for people to interact with small businesses, even if they have been stimulated?
Sure. Well, we tell you that government investment in particular is a lot more key than just like people going to these stores, because at the macro level, this kind of government investment is going to stimulate these small businesses. And because of that, they're going to be able to lower their prices. And not everyone is going to be taking out loans in Germany in the first place. So these high interest rates aren't necessarily going to be a deal breaker for consumers.
All right, great. And also, why should it be the small businesses in particular within Germany who are getting these stimuluses? After all, Germany does have many giants such as the auto and tech industry within it.
Sure. Well, I tell you in particular, with the Indiana University evidence, that small businesses are actually key to fixing Germany's like economic issues. So yeah, I think that's why small businesses in particular are good. And also like revitalizing these small businesses ensure that these like large corporate monopolies can't just dominate the German market.
All right, great. And finally, looking at your third point, you say that by getting rid of the debt brake, this would ultimately allow for more bipartisan action within the parliament. Why wouldn't there be anyone with sour feelings if, after all, there is a party that does not want the debt brake to be removed?
Well, I think that that's a possibility, right? But in the hypothetical world where like Kaiser Frederick kind of gets to make all of the decisions, I think that relaxing the debt brake would still be good overall. And even if some politicians are hesitant at first, just because a policy isn't popular with politicians, that doesn't mean that it's not good for everyday people. And at the end of the day, these politicians have to follow the lead of the people that are voting them into office.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Have a great
Thank
day.
you.
Thank you so much, Sash and Kaiser Friedrich. Those were great speeches and a good cross-examination. Now we've got our next speaker, Blake. Is he in the room yet? Yeah, he is. Awesome.
Hello.
Blake is going to be speaking on hypothetical number 5. Following
Yes.
his inauguration, Donald Trump uses paratroopers to seize the Panama Canal and halts all non-US flagged ships traveling through there. How should the United Nations respond?
Yep. And if I may ask, who's going to be giving time signals?
That'll be me.
I'll pin you. All right. Just let me know when everybody's ready, and I'll get started.
Yep. And for time signals, 5 down, C at 30, fist at grace is good.
Yeah, that's all good. If you haven't noticed, Elon Musk has been following Donald Trump everywhere, whether that be during his presidential campaign, in his rallies, or right now to his private jet. I mean, at this point, Donald Trump is going to have to start locking his bathroom door, because who knows, Elon Musk may follow him in. But nonetheless, even though Elon Musk is showing Trump a lot of love, Trump has his eyes on a different prize. As reported by Reuters on just 7 days ago, that Donald Trump wants to seize the Panama Canal from Panama, as not only it was US built, but also Donald Trump feels as Panama is charging American ships way too much money just to travel through there. But as reported by Tabroom just 30 minutes ago, he's actually taken it a step further and militarily seized the canal. And when considering that McKinsey and Company reports just this year that the Panama Canal accounts for 6% of global goods running through it, it's imperative that we ask today's question in today's hypothetical situation. Following his inauguration, Donald Trump seizes the Panama Canal by using paratroopers and flagging all non-US ships to not run through there. How should the UN respond? And the answer is that they need to ensure that the US leaves by using a series of ultimatums. First, by carrying out a peacekeeping operation. Second, by freezing assets. And finally, by banning military cooperation with the United States. Even though at times, specifically under George Bush, it seems like the United States does not have a lot of interest in peace. And under Donald Trump, it may seem like the same situation. And that's where the UN can step in with peacekeeping. Because the first way that the UN should respond to a potential Donald Trump military seizure of the canal is by carrying out peacekeeping operations. Because that same article from McKinsey and Company furthers on January 19th of this year by explaining what would happen if the Panama Canal dried up. They explained that since the Panama Canal is so vital for global trade, it would be detrimental if it dried. Specifically because since global commerce is not prepared for such an event, thousands of ships would be diverted south to Argentina's Cape of Good Hope, raising the prices of shipping and commerce. But on the other hand, if Donald Trump actually decided to also do this artificially, that's where the UN can step in. Because an article from the Security Council Research Center explains just 3 hours ago that in response to Yemeni Houthi rebels bombing ships in the Red Sea, they instituted a resolution where they sent peacekeepers to the Red Sea to ensure that nothing would happen from then on in the Red Sea. And as a result, since then, the world, specifically the Red Sea, hasn't seen any shipping attacks from the Yemeni Houthi rebels. And if the United Nations takes the same course of action in the hypothetical, it's clear that America will feel threatened at actually instituting a ban on all other ships. Hopefully, dropping the amount of damage that occurs from such a situation. If there's one thing that the United States likes, it's money. And when you take that away from them, they don't get happy. Because the second way that the UN should respond in the hypothetical situation is by freezing assets. Because an article from the Brookings Institution highlights on November 14th of this year that Donald Trump's isolationist foreign policy, specifically through his tariffs, are at all foreign policy because he feels independent from the rest of the world. Not only because economically America produces just about everything at home, but also America can remotely run the global financial system, or SWIFT, just from their home without actually having to meddle with global economic affairs. But that's exactly why the United Nations needs to reduce their financial independence. Because an article from the United Nations details just last year that oftentimes in times of crisis, the United Nations institutes a financial, rather asset freeze, where all countries of the United Nations, if a resolution passes, are not allowed to carry out financial transactions with the United States. And with Americans holding so many assets overseas, there's no doubt that economies would drastically slow in the United States if an asset ban were to happen. And thus, the United Nations, or rather the United States, would be very much deterred for actually seizing the Panama Canal more than it can afford to. But also, America is very vital in global military affairs. And Donald Trump hopefully wants to keep that. And that's why the United Nations should take advantage of this liability. Because the final way that the UN should respond to the hypothetical question today is by banning military cooperation with the United States. An article from the Department of Defense contextualizes on January 10th of last year that the United Nations, or rather the United States, collaboration with other countries militarily is absolutely vital for the country to protect its global interests. Because by collaborating with, for example, European allies, it can ensure that it doesn't have to deploy troops overseas while also getting what it wants. And that's where the United Nations can once again exploit where the United States hurts most. Because an article from the New York Times explains from UN News explains on September 29th of this year that in a different UN resolution in response to the Yemeni Houthis, what they actually did was completely ban all military cooperation, from normal gun transfers to any military talks at all. And if this same resolution were to happen to the United States, it's clear that it would be detrimental for its foreign policy, no longer being able to protect its interests at home, thus deterring the United States from doing anything wrong. Today, we asked the question, or today's hypothetical. If Donald Trump decided to seize the Panama Canal by deploying paratroopers and flagging all non-US ships, what should the UN do? And today, we answered that it should give a series of ultimatums to the United States. First, by carrying out peacekeeping operations. Second, by freezing American assets. And finally, by banning military cooperation. So even though Elon Musk may be following Donald Trump around everywhere, with a UN series of ultimatums, the world will be following America nowhere. Thank you. Okay.
All right, thank you so much. That speech was 7 minutes and 7 seconds, just for everyone else. And I believe you're going to be cross-examined now by Daniela. And just for reference, the time signals for the 3-minute cross-sects are going to be 2 at 2 minutes, 1 at 1 minute, C at 30 seconds, Fist at 0 seconds. Daniela, I'll start the timer on your first word.
Okay, hi. Nice to meet you. Congratulations again on a really great speech. Of course, I have a few questions. So on your first point, let's talk about this like peacekeeping missions analysis. You talk a lot about like the Houthi rebels as being kind of synonymous with the United States, but at the end of the day, the Houthi rebels are just a small group, whereas the United States is like a multi-billion-dollar country. I would argue that although the peacekeepers may be enough against the Houthi rebels, it's not enough against the United States government, especially considering that paratroopers are being used in this case. How would you deal with that tension?
So Well, even though the United States has a much larger military than the Houthis, that doesn't mean that the context doesn't apply here. If the United States deployed paratroopers in the Panama Canal, it would have a many less troops over there compared to where they have on the mainland. And thus, it would actually probably be a comparable size, considering that the United States has to export these troops to the canal.
Okay, I'm not sure I entirely agree with that, but we can talk about your second point now. You say that the United States has strong domestic industries and that we produce everything at home, in your own words. So why would freezing assets impact us if our domestic industries are so strong?
Well, once again, I said that was just one of the things that Donald Trump has to take for granted what is financial independence. But I said that the main thing in that subpoint was our remote financial running of the world. The SWIFT financial system is what is used by most of the Western world. And if the United States were to lose that financial control, that would definitely offset Trump no matter how many goods we produce at home.
Sure, just a quick follow-up. I still think that I don't necessarily buy that because at the end of the day, we are still one of the most wealthy countries in the world. Even if long-term freezing assets would be a good strategy, in the short term, if the Panama Canal were to be dried up by Donald Trump, it still wouldn't do enough. But let's talk about your last point now. You talk about how banning military cooperation would be a good strategy for the United Nations. But again, I just don't really buy this. The United States has one of the strongest militaries in the world, and we outpace every other nation exponentially in terms of military spending. So why would banning military cooperation have any impact whatsoever?
Just think about what we do with other countries, like, for example, in the Indo-Pacific with the Philippines. We collaborate a lot with the Philippines so they can hopefully subvert Chinese influence in the South China Sea. But if we were to lose that, in order to get exactly what we would want in the region, we would no longer be able to collaborate with the Philippines and instead have to do it ourselves, something that Donald Trump doesn't want to do.
I think you talk a lot about how Trump is isolationist, so I would argue that means he wants to do things himself, but I believe that's time. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right, cool. Thank you all so much.
Hello.
Hey, our next speaker is going to be Sadie, answering hypothetical number 4. A revived, technologically advanced Japanese imperial fleet reemerges from the Arctic, with its course set for Beijing. Reports emerged that Japanese troops had executed coups in North and South Korea, setting up a full-scale invasion of China. How should China respond? And I'll also leave that in the chat for my judges, because I know it's kind of long.
It is very long. Can everyone see okay?
Yeah.
All right.
And how do you like time signals, by the way, if at all?
I was just gonna time myself if that's all right with you.
That's totally fine. Yeah.
All right, perfect. Let me pin myself real quick, and then I'm ready to go. Is there anyone not ready? Great, then I'll begin upon my first word. When we think of Japan, it's likely that we have some cultural ideas in our head. Things like anime, manga, and Hello Kitty. But what you probably don't know is that almost all of these things were created, or at least revamped, to distract you from Japan's atrocities in World War II. But while they've distracted you for an incredibly long time, it seems that you might be remembering soon. Because, as Austin, Kim, and Tabroom reported to me just 30 minutes ago, a Japanese imperial fleet coming from World War II has re-emerged from the Arctic, with its sights set on Beijing. We're also finding out that North Korea and South Korea have been incapacitated by coups. And so it's considering that the last time Japan, more specifically Imperial Japan, invaded China, it led from anywhere to 3 to 10 million deaths, that it becomes imperative we answer today's all-important hypothetical. A revived, technologically advanced Japanese imperial fleet reemerges from the Arctic with its course set for Beijing. Reports emerged that Japanese troops had executed coups in North and South Korea and setting up a full-scale invasion of China. How should China respond? The answer, fortunately, is that all China has to do is simply defend itself, because it actually has nothing to worry about. First, because of their economic reliance on China. Second, because of China's large military. And finally, because they are still allies with Russia. Many believe military conflict to be purely about combat and lives, but there's actually something that breaks a military conflict much, much faster. And to quote the wise words of our former President Bill Clinton, it's the economy, stupid. That serves as to why the first reason that China has to simply defend itself is because Japan is already economically reliant on China. Indeed, as an article by Open Global Rights explains to us, on June 13th of 2024, that China currently possesses the world's largest microchip and semiconductor economy, and it's the largest exporter of this to the world. While it's beneficial to the world, Japan is no excuse. Indeed, as an article published by Foreign Policy on March 23rd of 2024 explains that Japan currently relies on China for microchips, and its microchip industry is huge, used for things like technological advances, quality of life works, and even the military. Japan's technological advances heavily rely on microchips. And when they attack China, it's going to be impossible for them to not feel the repercussions of China placing economic sanctions, meaning that even if microchips being stopped sold to Japan doesn't stop the war instantly, it will stop it in the long term. You've likely heard the joke that the United States Navy is the largest Navy in the world, and that our Air Force is the largest Air Force. The reason people don't tell you that joke regarding the Army is because that actually goes to China. And that serves as to why the second reason, that all China has to do is simply defend itself, is that China currently has a massive military, as the U.S. Institute for Peace explains to us in an article published on May 24th of 2024, that China's military is huge, the largest in the world, sitting at 2 million active personnel, with 500,000 just sitting in reserves. This would be terrible for Japan and their invasion prospects, because as an article by The Economist, published on March 3rd of last year, explains that currently Japan only has 240,000 active military personnel, meaning that even with some bolstering caused by the fleet from the 1940s, they still wouldn't have enough troops to win any kind of land battle against China. It's simple mathematics now to understand that a battle against China would be futile because they would lose on foot. But considering that while China and Russia have been allies for a long time, we have to consider what happens to Japan's new technology. Did their fleets get the aux cord? And if it did, I have a song suggestion. Here Comes the Sun by the Beatles, which serves as to why the third and final reason that China just has to simply defend itself is because they are still allies with Russia, as an article by the Council on Foreign Relations reports to us. On December 12th of 2024, Russia and China are extremely close allies, not just on a fiscal level, but on a personal level. President Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin meet nearly every week to discuss economic proposals and, more importantly, how they can defend themselves from other countries. And defend themselves they will if China decides to invade Russia, or rather, if Japan decides to invade China, because as an article by CRS Reports explains to us, on December 2nd of this year, that currently Russia possesses 1,700 nuclear missiles that they can use at their discretion at any time. They also possess the world's third largest military behind China and the United States, While using nuclear weapons is a war crime, these Japanese generals who come from World War II have already committed war crimes on a global stage, meaning that Russia can likely attack them with their nuclear weapons with little to no repercussion, and they'll jump at the chance to do that. And so it's returning to today's all-important hypothetical. A revived, technologically advanced Japanese imperial fleet reemerges from the Arctic, with its course set for Beijing. Reports emerged that Japanese troops had executed coups in North and South Korea, setting up a full-scale invasion of China. How should China respond? The answer is simple and fortunate, that they just have to defend themselves because they have nothing to worry about. First, because of Japan's economic reliance on China. Second, because of China's massive military. And finally, because China is still an ally with Russia. You might be distracted by Hello Kitty from Japan's first World War II atrocities, but it seems these World War II soldiers won't stay in your mind for very long either.
Thank you so much. Just for the other judges, that speech was 7 minutes and 3 seconds. And now Blake is going to cross-examine you. It's a 3-minute cross-ex period. For time signals, I do 2 for 2 minutes left, 1 for 1 minute left, C at 30 seconds, and a fist at 0. Blake, I'll start the timer on your first word that you have.
Great.
Okay. Congratulations on a great speech. I thought your points were very good. I just have a couple of questions.
Thank you.
So in your first point, you
course.
said Japan was very reliant on China for microchips. But how can this be true if China is behind both Taiwan and the United States on 2 nanometer chips?
Okay, of course. So allow me to explain. China and Japan are both very geographically located. So yes, it is possible that Japan can get microchips from areas like Taiwan or the United States of America. However, because of the closeness and easy access to trade, Japan needs China for its microchip sector.
But wouldn't Taiwan be closer than China?
Can you rephrase the question?
You said that geographic distance matters a lot. But if that's true, then wouldn't that be an advantage to Taiwan chips?
Sure, geographic location does matter in this case, but I also was more specifically speaking about how it's easier to trade with China than it is with Taiwan.
Okay, on to your second point. You said that Japan would be no match for China's military, but even though this could be just a one-on-one matchup, how can you completely disregard the fact or the possibility of the United States or other powers in the region like the Philippines joining in?
Of course. So first we can discuss, the mutually assured destruction, that China and America aren't ever going to go to war with each other unless it's absolutely paramount. But more importantly, let's speak about the actual hypothetical. This is an imperial ship coming from World War II, attempting to attack China again. These people have already committed war crimes on a global stage. And if the United States and, say, the Philippines were to find out about that, there is no way they would come to aid them in a war.
Of course, but nor are these generals from World War II, or are these ships. The question is, a Japanese imperial fleet reemerges. It's not necessarily saying the same ships. And of course, a technologically revived Japan would no doubt make new ships. And also, considering that, why wouldn't the United States aid Japan if China is a mutual enemy of the two?
Sure. Well, let's talk about first the mutual enemy idea. Already we can see that in world law, we don't aid people who attack. We aid people in defense. If Ukraine had attacked Russia, we wouldn't have come to Ukraine's defense and helped them back Russia. We would have left Ukraine. However, Ukraine was attacked by Russia, and therefore we came to defend Ukraine. We're not going to defend and help Japan when they're the aggressor in this situation.
I'm actually glad that you brought that up, because onto your third point, you're talking about Russia and China cooperating militarily.
Yes.
So if China was aiding Russia, but not necessarily directly getting their
I'm
troops
sorry.
involved.
That's time.
Oh, sorry. Oh, thank you. I didn't have
Thank you both so much.
I didn't see it.
All good. It happens
Wally,
sometimes.
I'm going to be cross-examining Boyana, correct?
Correct.
Great, thank you.
All right, our last speaker, Bayana, is in the room, and she's going to be speaking on hypothetical number 7. In a surprise attack, Argentina retakes the Falkland Islands. How should Britain respond?
Perfect. For time signals, could I just have the standard 5 down, a C at 30 and a fist at 7? Perfect. And can I know who's giving time signals?
Yeah, this.
Just in case, I'll time myself if that's fine. But that's everything. Can I get a thumbs up just to know if everyone's ready? Wonderful. Then, if everyone is good, I will begin. In 2022, Argentinian officials jokingly said that they would kidnap the British Defense Secretary should he threaten anything about a disputed territory of theirs, known as the Falkland Islands. However, the only thing being kidnapped or stolen away might be Argentina's dignity, because, come on, for government officials, that's a low blow. Beyond that, it appears that this back and forth isn't anything new, meaning that Argentina has certainly been losing dignity for a while. According to CBS News just 1 week ago, the conflict in the Falkland Islands is one that has been going on for decades. In fact, ever since the 19th century, Argentina and Britain have been in limbo over who actually holds rights to the land. Unfortunately, although Britain currently has claims to the Falkland Islands, Argentina's been getting bolder and bolder. BBC explains on May 5th of 2024 that they could even attack in the future as early as 5 years forward. So considering both this risk, but also because the last time there was a conflict there, it took nearly 1,000 lives, we must answer today's question, or that is, hypothetical. In a surprising attack, Argentina retakes the Falkland Islands. How should Britain respond? And the answer is by doing everything to deter future conflict. They can do this in 3 ways. First, by ensuring that the conflict is isolated to the Falklands only. Second, by deploying its navy as a deterrent. And finally, by hosting an international conference for condemnation. Now, the Falklands has been a disputed territory since the 1960s, but that doesn't mean it has to be one going forward, especially if Argentina was to try and retake it. And that's why the first step that Britain can take is to make sure this is a conflict that's isolated between only those 2 powers. And we can turn to the past as a way of seeing how this could work out. According to the National Standard, a British-based newspaper on May 3rd of 2024, ever since the 1960s, when the original Falklands conflict began, it hasn't been one between just Argentina and Britain. In fact, it's involved multiple powers. For example, Israel was donating weapons to Britain, while Peru was on the other side of the conflict, giving to Argentina. As a result, not only were their ships intercepted and weren't they susceptible to military attacks, but they themselves had to face economic hardships because of the conflict. In order to avoid both this and the chance that there is a spillover should Argentina retake these islands, it's important that Britain makes the first step and makes sure that this conflict is isolated. Thankfully, there is a way to do this, and they can learn from their past mistakes. As a separate article from the National Interest magazine points out on July 3rd of 2024, the past time there was a conflict, there was a step Britain could have taken to establish an exclusive maritime zone, which would ensure that other nations can't get involved, and therefore the conflict is isolated. So, should Argentina retake the Falklands, it's up to Britain to ensure that this doesn't involve other powers and invite even more war. So to deter future conflict, it must make sure it's isolated. But beyond that, it's also clear that Britain's kind of a big deal, if its golden centuries of rule have taught us anything. And while it doesn't need to go back into its colonial era, it certainly can take some other steps to prevent conflict, such as deploying its military as a deterrent force, this being the second way in which they should respond to a potential takeover. It's described by the House of the Lords in greater detail in an article published October 4th, 2024. Ever since the 18th century, Britain and Argentina have been in this spat over the Falkland Islands. But the only reason they haven't attacked until the 1960s was because Britain didn't have enough forces for Argentina to believe that they shouldn't attack. As a result, the war in the 1960s occurred, and with it, thousands of lives were lost. However, if they were to try and retake that would simply be because they don't see Britain as a strong enough deterrent. And that means they would have to change that, both to scare off Argentina's forces and to make sure they don't repeat this in the future. This is furthered by an article published in the New York Times on November 11th, 2024. This is because Britain's navy is superior multiple ways to Argentina's. Not only does it currently have 1,200 soldiers stationed there, but additionally, it has maritime technology that no other country in the world, except some of the most developed, have access to. Not only would this be enough to scare away offenders like Argentina in our hypothetical, but it would both prevent their takeover from getting worse and deter them from enabling future ones. But finally, it's important that the world can react to such an offense, because just like the Russo-Ukrainian War taught us, without getting together, we can't solve anything. That's why hosting an international conference for righteous condemnation should be the last way Britain responds. This is further detailed in a British newspaper known as The Daily on October 3rd, 2024. If such a war were to occur, such as the Falkland Islands War in the 1960s, it would be crucial that Britain invites other powers in order to recognize that this would be an illegal invasion. This is even supported by the War on the Rocks magazine on October 19th of 2024, when they say that if an invasion were to occur, it would be illegal because Britain is currently in control of the Falklands. As a result, it is important that this receives the same treatment that both the Russo-Ukrainian invasion received, as well as other illegal invasions. And it's detailed by the Washington Post on November 3rd of 2024, when they detail that not only is Britain committed to condemning international offenses, but should Argentina attack, that would be another example of it flexing its muscle and showing the international community that they must hop on board and condemn. So, considering the gravity of this hypothetical, we must return and ask it once more. In a surprise attack, Argentina retakes the Falkland Islands. How should Britain respond? The answer is by doing anything to deter future attacks. By first, ensuring that it's isolated. Second, deploying its navy. And finally, hosting an international conference for condemnation. While Argentine officials may still think this is a joke, it's important that Britain and the rest of the world shows it isn't. All right, thank you so much. And I believe I have someone to cross-examine me right now.
Yeah, that's right.
That's me.
Perfect.
And for time signals, 2 at 2 minutes, 1 at 1 minute, C at 30, Fist at 0. Sadie, I'll start on your first.
Excellent speech, Boyana. I just had a couple of questions. First, let's talk about your first point, the idea that Britain must isolate the conflict in order to make it better for them. And you specifically speak about, in your second subpoint, about establishing an exclusive maritime zone, that of which people can't interfere on. What about countries that don't interfere militarily, like countries that will send monetary or military aid to Argentina without ever setting foot in the conflict?
Excellent question. This actually kind of goes in line with the examples I brought up of Israel and Peru, who, apart from military intervention, also sent economic aid. By establishing a maritime or an exclusive maritime zone, it's important that we realize Britain sets a precedent. It shows that this is a conflict it doesn't want other interference in. And while in the other case, where it doesn't establish this zone, it may be worse. It could invite interference rather than detract it. And it's important that they set this rule now rather than wavering and then being surprised when economic aid does come anyways.
Sure. Second, let's talk about the actual maritime zone itself. How would one be established, considering that Britain doesn't have full control or rights to the oceans around the Falkland Islands?
I believe since it does currently have control over most of it, it would be able to at least extend its current maritime zone by a reasonable amount. So by extending what it currently has, I think that would be the best way to prevent a spillover.
All right, cool. Let's move to your second point, that they should deploy their navy as a deterrent force. When we've deployed deterrent forces before, like the War on Terror in 2001, it's bolstered terroristic groups and made them more aggressive. How would you have no guarantee that Argentina isn't going to become emboldened by this deterrent force and instead attack because of it?
Excellent question. There's just one distinction we have to make right now. Between terrorist forces in Argentina, only one of them are actually armed enough to resist deterrence. In the case of Argentina, however, put simply, they don't have the force nor the economic power to resist Britain. So, in this case, by deploying their navy, Argentina would not be able to do anything other than to either pull out or never attack again.
All right, let's move on to your third and final idea, the idea of righteous condemnation. Doesn't that entirely counteract your first point, considering that reaching out to the United Nations or some kind of other summit would inherently involve nations, and often condemnation resolutions in the United Nations involve sending aid to the one who was attacked?
Not at all. There's a difference between economic and military aid that's supposed to further an operation, like a military operation, and aid that's made simply to ensure that there's humanitarian aid and that this conflict doesn't get out of control. Also, condemnation is purely diplomatic in most cases, which would be all we need in order to show that invasions will not be tolerated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you both so much. And thank you to everyone who gave amazing speeches and asked awesome questions in this round. I think we're going to be ending this recording now. Just to anyone who's listening in, make sure to check out the rest of the Equality and Forensics YouTube channel if you want to learn how to speak like all of these awesome speakers. We've got a bunch of lectures, other round recordings, and other great resources. So yeah, thank you all so much.